Just waiting for a few more people to come in.
Okay.
Actually, you can sit over here in a chair and just watch it from over here. You won't be on camera.
All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for the latest installment of Novel at Home, a series of virtual author events bringing authors to your living room, or home office, or back patio, or wherever you're enjoying your Zooms these days. Your support is so valuable to a small business like ours, especially in challenging times like these, and we thank you for being with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming our two very distinguished guests. Lawrence Wells, the author of the new memoir, In Faulkner's Shadow, is the director of the Yaknipatov Press in Oxford, Mississippi, an independent publishing house he founded with his late wife, Dean Faulkner Wells. He is the author of 2 novels, co-founder of 2 literary journals, and an award-winning scriptwriter. His documentary, Return to the River, produced by PBS and narrated by James Earl Jones, won an Emmy in 1994. He'll be joined in conversation this evening by Carl Rollyson, Professor Emeritus at Baruch College, the City University of New York, and author of numerous biographies of literary figures such as Sylvia Plath, Susan Sontag, and Norman Mailer, as well as film icons Marilyn Monroe and Dana Andrews. His latest work is a 2-volume biography of William Faulkner, the 2nd volume of which was published this month. In the chat feature this evening, I will be posting links where you can purchase both Mr. Wells's and Mr. Rollson's books from Novel's website for pickup, delivery, or shipping. Again, as a small business, we appreciate your support so much. I think we're all in for a wonderful conversation this evening. Toward the end of the event, I will appear back on screen and moderate some audience Q&A. So if at any point you'd like to enter a question in the Q&A function, you'll have a chance to have it answered towards the end of the program. Now, without further ado, please join me in giving our guests a warm, if virtual, welcome.
Hello, Carl.
Hello, Larry. Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
I'm talking to you from Cape May County, New Jersey, which I think is about 1,500 miles from you.
Yeah.
I used to say it was below the Mason and Dixon line, but Jack Elliott, a Mississippi historian, tells me I'm in error. So I'm going to have to research that one. I know your book is off to a good start. You've already been doing some good events for it. Needless to say, I'm interested in it, given the title, In Faulkner's Shadow. Clearly, a Faulkner biographer wants to know even more, and you have more to say in your book. I thought I'd begin by just asking you, what made you decide to write a memoir and publish it now? Is there something about now that really prompted you to do this book?
Well, the book really started right after Dean and I got married, actually. I wrote a novel about our crazy, tumultuous up and down courtship and her ongoing feuds with various family members, starting with her mother. And it was funny, and it was almost published by Dial Press. I heard from Bill Decker, the editor. Does that name ring a bell with you, Bill Decker?
Yeah.
He was a well-known editor in New York, and Dial Press bought the book for about 2 hours. He said, "Love it, I'll get your contract." Then the next thing I heard from him was the accounting boys, he called them the accounting boys, nixed it.
Yeah.
They had their own priorities, obviously. Anyway, I started writing that as a novel, and I'm so glad I did, because it was like a journal. It was like a diary. And I had all of those facts and conversations and descriptions while they were still fresh. And so I started with that. I typed it, by the way, in 1974 or 75. And so I had to get the typescript scanned into word capture so I'd have a Word document. That's what I started with. Around probably late 2011, Dean passed away in July. And part of my my recouping my, coming out of the grief was to write the book.
Yeah, that makes sense. You've written novels. Did it feel different to write a memoir?
It did, but people have told me this memoir reads like a novel.
Mm-hmm. It's a story.
Yeah, it's a story. And there's a lot of conversations and dialogue and descriptions of places. I'm coming to you tonight, for example, in Miss Maud Faulkner's house. What you see behind me is her living room, and that's her art on the wall behind me. And Maud Faulkner built this house in 1931, she and her husband Murray. And then he died in 1932. And she lived here alone for the most part until 1960. She died in 1960. I don't know if I ever told you this, but the novelist Elizabeth Spencer rented the front bedroom in 1946 when she was a graduate student at Ole Miss.
Yeah, that's...
Anyway, that's where I am. And this house is more than a setting in this book, because there's a certain amount of there's a certain mystical quality about this house.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into that later, I'm sure.
Yeah. Tell us more about the title, In Faulkner's Shadow. And particularly, I have something to say about this word shadow, but I'm interested to see what you'll say.
Okay, well, the shadow is both literary and the glare of fame casted a long shadow. For the Faulkner family, their problem was, first of all, who would be the spokesperson? And then secondly, how would they carry on the literary legacy that they had inherited? The first spokesperson was the oldest male. The Faulkners lived by primogeniture. And the oldest male was Jimmy Faulkner, and for a while he was the spokesperson, but Dean, because she was actually literary, and then not only read Faulkner, but understood it, she was able to, and she had an eloquence about her, Dean did. She was very, very good on the uptake when she was being questioned or interviewed. And she had a great memory. She actually had a photographic memory. And so that served her well. And she grew into the role of spokesperson. She didn't want to be the spokesperson because to do that, to a certain extent, she had to come out from under the shadow of her uncle and be her own person, be herself. And she did that beautifully. But then the other shadow is the literary one for the writers who live here, myself included. Now, when I wrote my first novel, Rommel and the Rebel, was a World War II adventure novel, but I made it a personal one by inserting William Faulkner in it as a character. I asked Dean's permission. I had the family's proxy straight from Dean. And so the fact that I was writing dialogue for Faulkner, sort of trying to get into his consciousness to a certain extent as he related to Rommel, and he had trained in the RAF in Canada, and he hated the Huns, and he had been programmed really, to fight the Huns, the Germans, and so to a certain extent, I took on. I understood him better than I ever had before. To use him as a character, you have to try to think like Faulkner. And I told Dean at some point, I said, I think he must have been looking over my shoulder, telling me what he wanted me to say, because who was I to try to project words into his mouth when he couldn't defend himself?
Yes.
Anyway, there was the shadow is both literary and familial.
Well, to someone who's a reader of Faulkner, and especially a biographer of Faulkner, as a biographer, in a sense, you're shadowing him, whether you're writing a novel or I'm writing a biography about Faulkner. But I also think of that shadow in The Sound of the Fury that Quentin keeps mentioning. The shadow is like another self. It follows you. You're being followed.
Yeah.
And certainly in your book, in your memoir, there's a sense that people have in a sense of Faulkner following them. I mean, I know you've told me stories about this and about the house, of Faulkner's presence in his mother's house.
Exactly.
And smelling that pipe that he used to smoke.
Yeah.
It's palpable. It's not just a literary conceit. It's something more tangible than that.
Yeah, it was tangible. Well, should I tell the story about when I've had the apparent visitation by Faulkner?
I think you better.
Okay. The dean and I were trying to decide whether or not to get married. It was 1972. We'd been dating for over a year. And there's that fail-safe point that you always cross. This was 1972. You couldn't live in sin. You had to decide. You had to get married. And she was a prominent figure in town, and people were wondering what's going on. So we still had, it was a big step. So we sat on our front steps one night until midnight, and without reaching a conclusion. So I went home to my apartment about a half a mile across town. And at 3 o'clock, I woke up sensing a presence in the room. And there was Faulkner's face at my window. Mm-hmm. Now, I had never seen any shape or any human form or anything at that window, but there was a street lamp outside on the street, and it cast a shadow through a tree that grew there. And so I had leaf shadow. Mm-hmm. Now, in this case, the leaf shadow coalesced into his face. So I'm looking at his face, and it's like a photograph. So the next day, I saw Dean on campus, and I said, you know, I think I saw your uncle at my window last night. And she said, was it at 3 o'clock? At 3 o'clock, she woke up and smelled his pipe smoke. Mm-hmm. He smoked a Dunhill brand that she knew very well because as a little girl, or 11 or 12-year-old, she and her step cousin Vicky would steal the pipe tobacco and roll their own and sneak around and smoke. Well, so she knew that pipe tobacco so well, and she woke up knowing that, or sensing that his presence was near. And she walked down the hallway following the scent of the smoke and turned on the lights in the dining room where he had slept on a cot in 1935 when his brother Dean, her father, was killed in a plane crash. Mm-hmm. And of course, he would have smoked his pipe there in the dining room. And he finished proofing the galleys of Absalom while he was staying here in the house to take care of his sister Louise, Dean's mother. So it's possible, who knows, that the pipe smoke could have saturated the walls and it came out when there was a certain humidity. But the fact that it came out when I saw his face at the window,
yes,
meant to Dean and me that we were mortally connected. And the common denominator was Mr. Bill. Mm-hmm. And so about a week later, we went out on a date, and she had a babysitter, and the babysitter was named Chrissy Price, and she lived at Roanoke and was the curator there after her, I think it was her uncle, Andrew Price. I don't think Chrissy was his wife. I think she was too much younger. Chrissy Price was connected to the Price family that worked for Mr. Faulkner. And there's a cabin behind the house. And she was there as a caretaker of the house for the University of Mississippi. But she was afraid of the dark and didn't want to walk up that long curving driveway by herself at night. So she asked us to walk up the driveway with her. So here Dean and I go with Chrissy. And about halfway up the driveway, a million fireflies all light up at the same moment, and they don't stop blinking. It's like an electric light bulb up there. It's so bright you can read by it. And I thought, oh, what is this? And Dean looked up at the cedars into that phosphorescent glow and said, Pappy. Because to her, his spirit had somehow assembled all the lightning bugs in Bailey's Woods and was letting us know that we thought he was welcoming us. And Chrissy, who had a certain deep sensibility of all things spiritual, said, Mr. William is with us.
You know, it reminds me of a passage from Go Down Moses, a Faulkner novel, in which there's this passage about, not really about the afterlife exactly, but about the human spirit. And the impression conveyed is, you know, all this suffering, all this experience, it all must be for something, you know, that it doesn't go away.
Yeah.
It returns in some form or another. And it seems to me you're talking about that in a way. I should say too, but by the way of another question, there are others in Faulkner's Shadow in your memoir. And, you know, if you look at the way your book is structured, for example, you have a whole section on Willie Morris and Barry Hanna. And they come, in a sense, in Faulkner's wake, so to speak. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, Willie Morris was hired at the University of Mississippi in 1980 as the first writer in residence the school had ever had. And Dean and I helped raise the money for his first year's salary. The university had not budgeted a writer in residence. They were thrilled that Willie wanted to come, but the money had to be found in outside sources, and it wasn't hard. But Barry came along the next year, and Willie was extremely popular, by the way. Now, Willie did not feel any pressure from Faulkner's Shadow, I don't think. Willie was not a fiction writer, you know, he was an essayist. And he was an editor first and an essayist second. And for that reason, he drew sustenance and inspiration from Faulkner's example and was not intimidated. Whereas Barry Hanna came in the next year, and he was a fiction writer and a really good one. But he was feisty and competitive, and he would wear a T-shirt at the Faulkner conference that said, "Read living writers." And the first time we met Barry, he was sitting in a professor's faculty house on campus playing with a Bowie knife. He loved weapons. And he looked up at Dean, and then he looked at me, and he said, his first words to me were not, "How are you doing?" or "Nice to meet you." It was, "I could overpower you and take your woman." Well, when he said that, Dean took it as a compliment, actually. She was flattered that he was flirting with her, actually. But she said, "You'll have to fight both of us." Well, he loved that. He called her that scrappy woman, that scrappy Faulkner woman from then on. And so Hanna was he always had a kind of a defensive posture and competitive streak there where Faulkner was concerned. But he admired Faulkner's work. I remember talking to him one time, and I said, "I bet As I Lay Dying is your favorite Faulkner novel." And he said, "How did you know?" And I knew that novel speaks to the spirit of Mississippi, downtrodden and going against the odds. Everything goes wrong, and the human spirit has to prevail. I mean, has to endure. It won't necessarily prevail, but it has to endure. And so Hanna did, of course, like all writers everywhere in America. I mean, Faulkner speaks to everybody. And it's not just Mississippi, but in Mississippi especially, there is all writers are compared to Faulkner in Mississippi.
Sure.
It's inevitable.
Yeah.
And so, but I would say that Willie was less affected by the sense of being overshadowed than Hanna was.
You mentioned earlier that I was mentioning is there a difference between novel and memoir? And you said some people say your memoir reads like a novel. I'd agree with that. And one of the things you get in your memoir is the kinds of scenes you would expect to read in a novel. And I'll just mention one example, which, again, to someone interested in Faulkner, especially a Faulkner biographer, really scene that you portray that really makes him come alive, is that croquet scene. Remember him playing croquet with Dean and Vicky, I guess that would be his step granddaughter.
Yeah, and Jill.
And Jill, yes, of course, his daughter.
Yeah. Well, I don't think people know about that until this book came along. Dean was my source, and Jill never spoke of it that I know. Dean and Vicky talked about that when they were being filmed for the film A Life on Paper. You know that film?
Yes, I do.
And it's William Faulkner, A Life on Paper. And that was an outtake that was not used. All of their chat about the croquet game. So I've managed to get my hands on a transcript of that, and I'm going to put that as an appendum in my paperback edition coming out next year.
Very good.
Yeah. But what happened?
Yeah, I was just going to say, tell people what Faulkner did from that. What happened in that croquet game that you described.
Well, let's see. It took place. Jill was 12 and she was born in 33, so it was 1945.
Yeah.
And
I want to say it was a dark and stormy night.
Yeah. Well, Faulkner put up a croquet court in his lawn in the spring, and he kept it up until the first frost in the fall. He loved it, and he loved playing with the girls. And playing croquet with them was a way to test their mettle, to get them I think to prompt the inner competitiveness of them and inspire them to be, tough-minded and competitive. He liked that, and he thought that would help them through life. Of course it did. And so Jill was 12, Dean was 9, and Vicky was 8. And in the middle of the game, a storm came sweeping in, and suddenly, the lightning began to strike all around Roanoke, and pretty close, with heavy thunder, and it began to rain, and the girls looked to Pappy. They instinctively, those girls were already deep into a rivalry for his approval. They would do anything for him. He was a god to them. And so they were not going to run for shelter until he did. They were waiting to take their cue because he didn't want them to think that one of them was a coward.
Yeah.
So the little girls waited and waited. The lightning keeps striking, and he held off as long as he thought he could get away with it. And finally, of course, to ensure their safety, he said, let's go and get under the porte-cochere, and they were happy to do so. But in that moment, I feel that their lifelong rivalry was born, and they never got over it. And in a way, they were struck by Pappy's lightning.
Mm-hmm. People think of him who don't know the biography or haven't read your memoir. I think their minds will change when they read it. Faulkner, often the image that people may have of him is this very sort of aloof modernist.
Yeah.
Very, very aloof and remote in a number of ways. And yet, in so many important ways, he was such a family man.
Very much so. He was very happy to take over leadership of the family, even though he didn't have a steady income and people needed money in the family. At one point, he said he was supporting 17 people.
Yes.
But
he sometimes sounds a little like Jason Thompson.
Yeah, well, oh yeah, absolutely. But the Faulkner was loved being the head of the family, and those girls meant a lot to him. Now think about it. He buys Roanoke in 1929. He doesn't have 2 dimes to rub together, but he got a great deal on that house. He was able to pay it off on time to the owner without taking a loan from the bank, and he had to rewire the house himself and put a new roof on it. He had carpentry skills. He enjoyed that, but then he needed a family, and of course he and Estelle were already married by then, and he has 2 children, Malcolm and Victoria, whose nickname was Chocho, which means butterfly in Mandarin. The children grew up in Shanghai until their mother got a divorce and moved back to Oxford. And Chocho spent more time at Roanoke than Malcolm did, because Malcolm lived with Estelle's family, the Oldhams. You point out in your book something I didn't know, which was that they were able to get the support check from Cornell.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. But anyway, so Chocho was there in the house with Estelle and William, and he doted on her. And she was a bright and incredibly gifted child and precocious. And he adored her. And then when Jill comes along and is born, and then later Dean and Vicky stayed there at the house off and on, he had those 3 little girls, and I think he really needed them. They gave structure to his life. He was a father to them. Now, as you know, one of the rules in the house was if the girls heard the typewriter keys clicking, they had to be quiet. They didn't quite know how it was that translated into an income. It's hard to think, it's just a class.
Neither did anybody else in Oxford understand that.
They didn't know what, when Jill was in the 1st or 2nd grade, the teacher asked them to write down their father's occupation. And she didn't know what William did for a living. And so she looked over at the girl next to her, and she had written mortician. and so Jill wrote mortician for William Faulkner. Yeah, but he loved those girls. They meant a lot to him, and of course he meant everything to them.
It's quite a moving story, and it's a generational story. It goes on for a long time, so much so that your memoir, in a sense, continues that story. It's yet another generation. You're looking back, but it's
right. Yeah,
it goes on.
Yeah, it sure does. And they acquitted themselves pretty well, Dean's generation. And then Jill surprised everybody with her Shakespeare's Child statement.
Yes.
When A Life on Paper came out, it turned out that they had filmed her in Charlottesville, at her farm in Charlottesville. And Bob Squire was the director and interviewer in that. And he asked her to tell about her father and her father's drinking. He asked her about the drinking. And she remembered a time when Faulkner was binge drinking, and her mother sent her there to try to take his bottle away from him. And he clutched his bottle to his chest and said, nobody remembers Shakespeare's Child.
Yeah, it's a shocking thing. Yeah.
It's shocking. And when Dean heard that on television, she didn't know Jill had said that until she saw the show. And she said, oh, poor Jill, she had to let it out. She couldn't hold that in any longer. And she felt really sorry for her cousin, that she had suffered that indignity and lived with it all those years. But of course, that was the way she was able to release it. Yeah,
it's interesting too that Jill inherited, or simply living in that family, I suppose, was in some ways like her father. I remember when I was interviewing you for my Faulkner biography, and I asked you, well, why did Dean wait so long to write her memoir?
Right.
She certainly could have written it earlier. And you remember what you said?
I remember what I said. She had to wait until Jill died
Mm-hmm.
In 2008, she could not take Jill's criticism. That would be too inhibiting for her.
Yeah. 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 So Jill had this, sense of command, this authority, and as you said, it was a hierarchical family.
Yeah,
So that you had to pay your respect to that.
absolutely. Speaking of Jill as an authoritative figure in the family, it started when she was 7 or 8 years old, and her parents were either drinking or, for whatever reason, were dysfunctional. And Jill took over the house,
Mm-hmm.
made sure that the meals were served on times, even dictated the menu, and made sure that her parents were up and dressed and at the table. And everything revolved around 3 meals in the day. And because she was 7 or 8 years old, and that was her concept of order, right?
Yes.
And I think for the rest of her life, order and a schedule were a major priority for her.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think that's right.
propriety.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We haven't mentioned this, and it is a part of your memoir. Your experience as a publisher, not just an author, in Yaknipatov Press. Maybe you should say a little bit about that, because that does figure in the memoir.
Yeah. Well, first let's start with the word yaknipatov.
Yes, good.
Yeah. Now, which is Faulkner's curse on the reading public, right? When I first encountered that word, I could not pronounce it, and it's intimidating because it's 2 words really. It's yakna, gentle, and patova, water in Chickasaw, gentle water. Yakna patova. And if you break it in half like that, that's fine. But if you try to take it all on at once, the Yaknipatov Indians themselves, part of the Chickasaw Nation, would probably have pronounced it yaknipatava. They would pronounce every syllable equally. Dean said that William pronounced it yaknipatava.
Uh-huh. I heard
didn't-
that once in a television production of Requiem, and I thought, well, they don't know how to pronounce it. That's interesting.
Right.
I didn't know that.
We say yaknipatava, and he said yaknipatava. I wouldn't be surprised if he actually met an Indian, a Chickasaw Indian, and put that word to him and to see how he would pronounce it. It would be just like him to have done that.
Mm-hmm.
But, so Yaknipatov Press was actually established in 1975 by an Oxford businessman, Howard Duvall, who had a men's shop on the square, a clothing store, Duvall's Men's Shop. And he had been a friend of Jill growing up. He had attended this party that when Intruder in the Dust was made, Jill wanted to meet the star. What was his name? Claude.
Oh, yes. The name escapes me. I know who you mean, though.
And he was handsome and young, very young. Jill was.
Yeah, he had been in The Yearling, and I still can't remember his name.
Yeah. And so they gave a party at Roanoke, and Faulkner for the first time allowed a record player, and the kids were able to dance in the house. And Jill wanted to dance with the young, handsome movie star, and Howard was there. And so Howard, in his later years, became a Faulkner collector, liked to collect first editions. And he decided that he would attempt to reprint John Faulkner's works, which were out of print, Dollar Cotton, My Brother Bill, and Men Working. And Jimmy and Chucky were the sons of John Faulkner, and they were happy for Howard to do that. And that's what he started with. And then in 1975, he did something pretty audacious and challenging. He produced an exact facsimile of Faulkner's first book, Marionettes, which Faulkner had drawn and sketched, illustrated the book, and wrote the text by hand. It was a 1-act play, as you know, and it was an allegory of the seasons. So he got Ben Watson to write an introduction, William Faulkner's classmate at Ole Miss who later became his first literary agent.
Yeah.
And so Howard published that, did a great job. So Howard had started Yaknipatov Press, and in 1976, his partner, to whom he had sold his business, he had gone into retirement and was going to be a publisher. His partner committed suicide. And Howard, the partner had bought was paying for the clothing store on time in making payments, and Howard still was able to take the business back and repossess it. And now he had to go full time into the clothing business again. And he needed some funding, and Dean and I bought into the press. We bought half the press then, because I was already working on the Cofield collection.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on how Howard courted me, took me to a fraternity party, remember? And the party was at Joe Park's house. Do you remember the Joe Park story?
Yeah,
with
the banker.
Yeah. So everything was connected, and Howard drove me around the county. He knew every landmark associated with Faulkner's work. I wish I could have taken you on that tour. In fact, next time you're here, let's do it. Let's go out and see if I can
love to.
Yeah, because the landmarks are still here, and only the people who have really saturated themselves with Faulkner's work and understand it well can appreciate it. To others, if they haven't read the books, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't matter. So I remember at the first Faulkner conference in 1974, Evans Harrington, who was the chair of the English department later, but then he was the Faulkner scholar. He took Elizabeth Kerr and other well-known scholars to Moti Daniels' store. Heard of the famous Moti Daniels?
Yeah.
He was a character who claimed to be Faulkner's bootlegger.
Yeah.
And his wife ran a country store. And here go the Faulkner scholars to Moti Daniels' store, where they are treated to saltine crackers and a big orange. Oh, and Vienna sausages. Vienna sausages. And it was that was their Faulkner experience, but they really appreciated it, and they could relate. And so the Faulkner Conference really lived off the terrain, you might say, because they had Faulkner's landmarks, and they had a bus tour. And then the Faulkner scholars could talk about their reaction to it and how it related in their imaginations to Faulkner's works. It was really interesting. And they've been running that conference every year since then. It's a big success. And you spoke there a couple of years ago. And
yes.
I'm sure that you'll be coming back next summer. I'm sure you'll be invited.
Yes.
Because let's talk about your biography for just a second. It's a 2-volume biography, which you undertook 5 years ago.
Yes.
And you did so with, I must say it was a courageous thing, because people were saying, what else is there to write about Faulkner? What else can we learn about him? And you proved the skeptics wrong, because you found really important material, which is mainly dealing with the film scripts of Hollywood, and how his work reflected what he learned in Hollywood, that he was a student of not just script writing, but also story structure. And I think one of the things you said was he learned to please an audience. Before that, he'd been writing for himself. He was his audience. That's why it's so hard to read Faulkner. He was writing for himself. But your work is so outstanding, and it's going to live a long time.
Well,
People
thank you.
will be reading you 50, 100 years from now.
Well, thank you. That's quite a compliment for a biographer. It's you never know how this is going to turn out. I thought that there would, even at this late date, there would be some people that I could still interview, And thanks to you, I was able to interview some people in Oxford who were quite young and when Faulkner was quite old.
Yeah.
And those are really, quite valuable perceptions. So I was able to do that. I was able to find material in archives that for one reason or another, other biographers had not discovered. So it was a wonderful journey of discovery with lots of generous people like you pitching in to make it a better book.
Well, that comes through, Carl.
Yeah,
that comes through in the book. Your book reads almost like a novel too, because you're a detective and you are taking the reader through his experiences, and we are experiencing Faulkner's deprivation and his poverty and his constant trying to be better than he was. He was always trying to improve himself, and he never felt that he succeeded. He felt that every novel was a failure because it wasn't perfect.
Yeah, tremendous.
And you make us relive that with him, and it's the whole. Your biographies are alive.
Thank you. Yeah, he had tremendous drive, and of course that's what I wanted to capture in the book. I know there are going to be some questions, so I don't want to prolong this, but I did want to sort of end with one more thing, which was, what did you leave out?
Oh. There were some things that I did leave out to protect the family. There were some embarrassing moments and things that I didn't feel should be. It was nobody's business but the families, and I had to honor the privacy. But there were chapters that I had to cut because they didn't go with the main theme.
Yes.
And I cut. You may remember because you saw an original manuscript. And it was pretty clumsy. It was 425 pages. And I wound up with 277 pages. And so I cut, and some of the chapters were fun. For example, a wedding chapter. Many crazy things happened. Our life was always dramatic. Life with the Faulkners is always dramatic. You never know when mischief is going to strike. It's just waiting around the corner.
Yeah.
So there were things that I did leave out, but I want to give you credit. I really benefited from your counsel through that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
well, yours is a very tightly put together book. That's in a way why I asked what was left out, because really good books often, it's like films, stuff is left on the cutting room floor. It just has to be because the story demands, certain details and a certain shape, and not everything is necessarily going to go into that shape.
Yeah, right. Well, it's great chatting with you, and now we'll see if we have any questions.
Yes.
Thank y'all so much. That was wonderful, and it's really a rare privilege and honor to get to just hear a conversation, but for me as a Faulkner lover and almost English major, to hear two distinguished people such as yourselves discuss from a point of such authority William Faulkner has been really enjoyable. Thank y'all so much. We do have a couple of questions so far. First from our good friend of Novel, Susan Cushman. She says, "Hi, Larry. Great to see you here. Thanks for hosting Novel." You're welcome. This book, I'll ask the same question I asked when you did the event for Square Books. Which was more fun to write about, the sections about Willie Morris and Barry Hanna, or the sections about Dean and the Faulkner family? I loved both, says Susan.
Yeah, well, that's really actually a hard question, Susan Cushman. But you asked me something about that before with the Square Books Zoom. I think that I enjoyed the Dean part more just simply because I was writing from our own experiences. Now with Willie and Barry, I was an observer. I was an impartial observer. And I was sort of caught in the middle to a certain extent with them because they did have a little feud going. And it was fun to write about, but at the same time, I had to be careful with that. Whereas with the Faulkner family, I was writing about my own experiences. And so I would say that was more fun. Is that okay? I think that's probably what you were looking for, Susan.
We have another question from our friend Donna, and I think that I think both of you should answer this question, actually. She says she hasn't read the book yet, but she looks forward to it. And if you had one of Faulkner's books to recommend to read first, which would it be? Shout out to Novel and Hottie Toddy.
Go ahead, Carl.
My recommendation, sometimes people say short stories of Faulkner's because they're very accessible, or a novel like The Unvanquished, which was originally written as Saturday Evening Post stories. But it seems to me you really need to dive in. You don't have to necessarily read his most difficult works, like As I Lay Dying isn't as difficult, say, as The Sound, the Fury, or Absalom, very difficult. I think I would start, especially because of the moment right now where we are as a country, Light in August. I would pick Light in August because I think it is accessible. It has these different plots. The story of Lena Grove, this really interesting woman of the earth, so to speak. The story of Joe Christmas. Is he black? Is he white? Does he have mixed blood? He has doubts about his own identity. The whole issue of race. But also, people often don't think of Faulkner as a political novelist, but to me, Light in August is a political novel. And when you get to a character like Percy Grimm, who organizes this militia, who goes after Joe Christmas and lynches him, you get the sense of the militias today, of people who want to take the law in their own hands because they think the society's out of control, even though in fact they are out of control. Faulkner understood that very well. In fact, he said in an interview that he had created a Nazi before he really knew anything about Nazis. This because Light in August was published in 1932 and Hitler came to power in 1933. So I think I would start with Light in August.
Absolutely, I agree with that. That's a great choice because of its relevancy. Mm-hmm. The Reavers is not bad though. Bad place.
No, yeah.
Reavers being a comedy, it's a light touch. I remember in that Life on Paper, they interviewed Phyllis Cerf, who was Bennett Cerf's wife, and that was his last book that Random House published, of course, under Bennett Cerf, and published posthumously, by the way. And she said, "That was the funniest book. I just laughed and laughed." And I think that it's very accessible also. It is. Comedy. And it's set in Memphis, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good one for people who live in Memphis. It's a really marvelous book. And Faulkner thought, he thought it was very funny. He used to say, I still laugh at that book. And it sort of brought him full circle back to some earlier themes in novels like Sanctuary. And he wrote it very quickly. He wrote it in about 6 months. And this was at a time later in his career when he thought he was slowing down. Well, he certainly isn't slow in The Reavers.
No, he had fun with it. You can tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, the last part of Donna's question was not a question, but a comment that she has read your Faulkner biography, Mr. Rollyson, and loved it.
Oh, great. That's good to hear. Yeah.
Leslie Stalls says, "Thank you for sharing your stories with us. Looking forward to picking up my copy at Novel." Thank you.
That's my cousin.
Welcome, Ken.
Yeah. Thanks, family.
Well, speaking of that, another familiar name on the list, William Justice. I know him quite well, and he lives in Oxford. And he wants to know, was Moti's store out on 334 just beyond Yakna? If so, it's about to fall in on itself.
Yeah, it was in Denmark. There's a little hamlet called Denmark. And his store was just down the road from that, just very close to the intersection, the road that goes to Takapola. William will know what I'm talking about. And the store is no longer there, or if it is falling down. He's right.
Mm.
Always just reminds me of Yakna River Inn. I know Larry must have been there. That was my favorite spot to eat in the world when I lived in Oxford.
Yeah. I once took Bill Eggleston there, photographer. That was a hoot.
A woman that I know because we were English majors at Ole Miss together is very good friends with him and works with him. So that's talk about a privileged position.
I took Bill Eggleston to an Ole Miss football game once, and we were sitting in the end zone, and the fans were yelling defense, defense, and it was a very important play. Nobody happened to look up except Eggleston. And I look at Eggleston, and he's staring at the sky, and I looked up too, and a balloon had become becalmed over the stadium. It was a balloon, and the gondola was maybe 300 feet, 500 feet above the stadium, totally motionless.
Hmm.
It was hanging over the stadium. It was really one of those mystical moments, and Eggleston was on top of it.
With his artist eye. All right, we have one more question. It's an anonymous question, but it says, do either of you have a story that speaks to Faulkner's sense of humor?
Well, you want to go ahead? I have one.
Go ahead.
Short one. This was told to me by, what was his name? Tommy, the son of the lawyer.
Freeland.
Yeah, Tommy Freeland. Yes. I couldn't remember his last name. He told me a story about Faulkner used to go to Phil Stone's law office in Oxford. And Phil Stone, of course, was Faulkner's earliest mentor, gave him things to read and really sort of gave him his first boost as a writer. And they were lifelong friends. There were tensions there. There were problems. But Faulkner liked to show up at the law office, and Faulkner was very interested in the law. If you read a book like Knight's Gambit, for example, it's all about the law and lots of other stories, and it comes in the novels. Anyway, Faulkner would visit Phil Stone's law office all the time, and Stone had no sign saying it was a law office. And his partner, Tommy's father, said, don't you think you ought to have a sign? Put a sign out there. And Stone said, no, everyone knows Phil Stone's law office in Oxford. There's no reason to do anything like that. But eventually they put up a sign. So here comes Faulkner one day walking along the street, and he wanted to see Phil Stone, and often Stone wasn't there, or sometimes Stone didn't want to see him and would go out the back. And so Faulkner would end up talking to the partner, the junior partner, so to speak. So one day they're sitting on the steps of Phil Stone's law office, and Faulkner looks over at that sign. It was a brand new sign. And Faulkner said, it's just wonderful how some things never change. That sign. just straight out, very, very matter of factly, and the poor junior law partner, he didn't know what to make of Faulkner. He had to know it was a brand new sign. Faulkner acted like, no, it's just part of years and years of going to Phil Stone's law office.
Okay, I was going to tell the story about when his movie, Today We Live, came out, premiered at the Lyric Theater in Oxford in 1932, was it? And maybe later than 33, maybe. It was based on his short story, Turnabout. And Turnabout is a military story about World War I, and it's all action, and it's about courage. And Hollywood turned it into a romance with Gary Cooper and Joan Crawford.
Yeah.
And so Faulkner, his cousin, ran the movie theater. I mean, his in-law. And
Bob Williams.
Yeah. Williams was the mayor also of Oxford. And Bob Williams begged him to say something at the movie premiere. And Faulkner stalks up to the front. Now, he may have had a couple of drinks, I don't know. But he turns around and faces the audience and he says, they're all hanging on pins and needles. What is he going to say? And he says in that sort of high-pitched voice of his, this movie bears no relation to the story I wrote. And then he walked out. Yeah, it had to be very satisfying for him.
Yeah.
He got his revenge on Hollywood.
Oh, yeah.
But sense of humor, he had one. Believe me.
Well, thank y'all so much. It's about coming up on 7. I know we've all enjoyed hearing from you both and appreciate your time and look forward to reading your work. Thank you everyone for being here. Again, I put the links to the books in the chat near the beginning. You can also call the store, come by if you're in Memphis. Anyway, we appreciate your support. We appreciate your time, gentlemen. Y'all have a
Great,
wonderful.
thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Enjoyed it.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
See you, Carl.
I'll see you, Larry.